Brentford striker Yoan Wissa has erased the club from any of his social media profiles as they reportedly increased the price on his head amid Newcastle's interest. In this video, we're going to be looking at the striker situation with Samu Aghehowa getting injured for Porto as well yesterday and Alexander Isak still at an impasse with the club. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much to everybody who's continued to support me. Please hit the subscribe button and the thumbs up on this video. Join the community ahead of what is a huge season for me and the channel and Newcastle United generally. We'll get into today the striker situation, as I mentioned, because Yoane Wissa has made more of a play to try and leave the club this summer. Alexander Isak is still at an impasse as a result of this and other things as well, and Samu Aghehowa, potential target for Newcastle, has been injured playing for FC Porto. But also David Ornstein has said this morning in the Athletics deal sheet that Newcastle remain interested in Jorgen Strand Larsen. So we're going to talk about all of that, and basically I'm going to, at the end of the video, give you what I think will be the outcome of what is becoming a bit of a messy chase for a striker, and this whole situation is not ideal for Newcastle. But we'll start with Yoane Wissa, who yesterday basically took the nuclear option, really. I think even Alexander Isak hasn't gone this far yet, and raised Brentford from any of his social media profiles, which is just petty and quite childish, and not really conducive, and doesn't really affect anything in a real sense, but it is, you know, very public, very symbolic, and not what you want to see. And, you know, I had a bit of a discussion with a few Newcastle fans yesterday, most of whom, you know, granted, and I'm sure you guys in the comment section agree, that what Yoane Wissa has done in this whole saga, the way that he's acted, is no better than Isak, and it really isn't ideal for anybody and not really respectful to what Brentford have done for him. You can't really have it one way with Isak and another way with Wissa. I know that you might say that there are certain things and certain differences, but ultimately, I said on Twitter yesterday, Brentford can put whatever price they want on Wissa's head. They can do what they want with him, and basically until his contract has expired, and that is maybe next year, but they also have an option for a further year, so it may be actually in reality 2 years. They can do whatever they want to do, and you know, we saw with Crystal Palace and Mark Gahey last year and with Liverpool this year that they are a very difficult customer to deal with. Brentford are in a situation where they, you know, after that result at Nottingham Forest on Sunday, it's going to be a difficult season for them. They've brought in Dango Ouattara to replace Brian Mbeumo. This is their stance anyway, and Yoane Wissa thinks that that should be enough for him to go to Newcastle. It isn't, and they are putting their foot down and raising the price because, apart from anything else, they know Newcastle are also very desperate for a striker. They know what situation Newcastle are in too, so they're being clever from their perspective, and you've got to respect where they are with that whole thing. And I don't have an issue with Brentford doing what they're doing. Yes, some people have said that there was a gentleman's agreement for him to leave for £26 million or whatever it was, but a gentleman's agreement isn't a contract, and, you know, get it in writing. And, you know, if you want to talk about getting things in writing, then nobody's putting transfer requests in, because when it's in writing, it makes it tangible, it makes it real. And I think that you can't, if you're not going to put a transfer request in, you can't then expect a club to adhere to a gentleman's agreement. I don't even know if that gentleman's agreement is the case. You know, that might just be agent talk. It might just be like Isak and Newcastle, who have denied this, that he basically told the club at the end of the season that it was his last season, that they are trying to change the narrative. And I think there's a lot of similarities in play here. But Wissa yesterday went to a step that even Isak hasn't gone to with Newcastle, in really sort of pushing himself into a corner where it now feels very, even with Isak, as I've spoken about, I still think there's a route back for Isak. Eddie Howe's been open and honest about how he wants him back in play if he's still at the club next season. I know he said he'll never play for the club again, but that again is kind of where it's kind of posturing, as I've said. I think with Isak there's a route back, and I think with Wissa doing this, it's so childish and so ineffectual that I just think that there won't be any goodwill from the Brentford fans anymore. You know, ultimately, I wrote a piece on this a few weeks ago. Ultimately, these things happen, and fans are often very quick to defend something if it benefits them and attack it if it's against them. I think, as I say, Newcastle fans have been quite open and honest that this isn't what they want to see from Wissa, just as it is with Isak. But it is very difficult for Newcastle to publicly criticise Isak or even privately criticise Isak when Wissa's doing this. Onto the valuation, £60 million, £50 million, whatever it is, it's going up, and Newcastle aren't willing to pay more than about 40 by the sounds of it. And the question I planned to ask when I was planning this video yesterday was, should Newcastle move on? But then the pictures got a bit bigger with Strand Larsen links and Samu's injury, and really I think the whole situation is a bit messy now. I think it's very, very difficult to see where Newcastle actually get what they want out of a striker search while also letting Isak go to Liverpool, because and I've said that for weeks that I don't think that's going to happen because of this. But I think really now, watching a little bit of Good Morning Transfers on Sky Sports News before I sat down and recorded, I'm currently recording it about 9:20 on Tuesday morning, but they basically said that Liverpool won't come back in because Newcastle have no way to go really, and I think this is how it'll end for me. I said on a podcast yesterday that Isak might even play at Leeds, because by that point, after the Liverpool game, I think we'll know either way whether he's going to go. So in that week, we'll know if Liverpool wants I think the Liverpool game's a distraction for both Newcastle and Liverpool in the sense that there won't be a deal done before that. After it'll become a bit clearer, but I still don't see it happening. So I think maybe by the time it comes round to Leeds, will Newcastle just say to Alex Isak that he can't go, so he may as well come back into the fold? We'll see on that. I'm not holding my breath, but that was what happened with Yoan Wissa a few years ago, and by that point I don't think Newcastle are going to sell him on deadline day, especially if they don't have a replacement. So I wonder if he might be reintegrated around the Leeds game for the Wolves game, perhaps after the international break. Surely he'll be in the Sweden squad. There were some interesting quotes from John Dahl Thomason, who's the Sweden manager, basically defending him, saying that he's a professional guy, but also did say that training kind of is important and he'll be back in team training hopefully soon. And I think what he probably means is he'll be in team training with Liverpool, but he might well have to be in team training with Newcastle. And it's interesting that team training is important to him playing for Sweden. And of course it is, he needs to be at his absolute best to be ready for them in a World Cup year. So, as I've said, really he has no leverage. And if he's still at Newcastle, it's in nobody's interest, least of all his, to not be in the team. So that's what I think will happen. And whereas Yoane Wissa, it's a little bit more complicated now that he's done this, as I say, childish action in deleting all of his social media. It doesn't actually aid anything in terms of getting him out, but it just further burns the bridges with Brentford and further makes it more difficult for him to go back. And I don't think Isak's quite at that stage with the people who matter, which is the players and Eddie Howe. So we'll see how that develops. But yeah, Wissa, I think if he's valued at 60 million, should Newcastle move on? Potentially, but where do they move on? And I'm going to give some thoughts at the end of the video, as I say, but in terms of an Isak replacement, Samu Aghehowa going off after 30 minutes in tears yesterday in a win for Porto is not a good sign. Newcastle have got interest in him in terms of they've discussed him and they haven't made a bid or anything, and they have made inquiries at £80 million, which I think they've kind of balked at, and it's too much of a risk. But him being off the table, if this is the case with his injury, that is not good news for Newcastle in terms of where they look for options. Strand Larsen being linked again, intermediaries according to David Ornstein in the deal sheet on The Athletic, as I said. But that's complicated because Wolves, like Brentford, are in relegation trouble, you would imagine, this season. They've already lost Cunha. There's a goal scorer there in Strand Larsen who's scored double figures for the last 2 seasons. He's going to probably be there and hang their hat on to keep them in the league. And if they sell him, it'll be, at the very least, I'd say £60-65 million, which is not the sort of money that he's ever going to be really worth in the market. It's the sort of money that you would look at to pay for an Isak replacement. Obviously, they've bid similar money for Ekitike and Sesko in the last few weeks. So it doesn't feel like Strand Larsen is likely, especially when you consider that on the other side of the transfer deadline, Wolves come to St James's Park. So like the Liverpool game being a factor for the Isak deal, that would surely be a factor for the Strand Larsen deal. It's only at intermediary level at the moment, and I just think that the whole thing is very difficult. There is a conversation that I've had with somebody in the last few days that's really interesting in terms of the way that the market works, because you know there's this idea that the transfer market is blown out of all proportion at every level. All transfers are inflated, when actually, really at the top end, the inflation is stopping. So like Strand Larsen being 60-65 million, Ouattara being 40 million, those sorts of deals that we keep seeing at sort of mid-range players that are going for 40, often sometimes 50 million, but certainly 30 million. I mean, if you're a Premier League player, you've got 3 on the start of your valuation these days. There's only so far that the top end players can go in terms of their inflation. So Isak isn't moving forward. Newcastle aren't demanding 180 million because they've seen Ouattara go to Brentford for 42 million, even though that would probably be the sensible thing to do. So Newcastle would actually technically lose out on that, because an Isak becomes more valuable by Ouattara being 43 million rather than less, which is quite an interesting way of looking at it. Newcastle are in a really difficult situation now. They should have got a striker earlier in the window, because they knew for months, even though they had discussions with Callum Wilson, that he was leaving and that they needed to replace him with a mobile striker and somebody who's worthy of coming in for Isak, and that was always going to be difficult. Obviously, they tried with Delap and they tried with João Pedro, but you're looking at Calumiendo going to Nottingham Forest. He scored a lot of goals in Ligue 1. You look at Evan Gasson going to Aston Villa. He scored a lot of goals as well. Plenty of other strikers that I've discussed on this channel that would have been good ideal options. I think we're beyond the point of talking about what Newcastle should do and who I think they should sign, because with so few days left of the window, it just feels like it'll be Wissa, or it'll be one of the options that has been mentioned, or somebody maybe off the radar. But the trouble is that those options are very, very slim on the ground. There aren't that many great options out there anymore. So I wonder, this is what I think might happen, if they keep Isak and try and get somebody on loan with an obligation to buy. With that situation, depending on how desperate clubs and players get, the quality of that player can fluctuate. So maybe it'll be Nicholas Jackson as an example, because Chelsea have no need for him. He wants to leave, and they don't actually necessarily need the money. They would like the money. I think that's fair, but they're not going to get 80 million for him. If it gets to late in the window, could Newcastle strike a deal for a loan with an obligation to buy and have him and Isak next season? Obviously, they can't have Jackson and Wissa, as I've mentioned, because of the AFCON, but that could be something that could happen. Obviously, Gonzalo Ramos, the valuation and the wages on his head are making that difficult. But again, could a deal with PSG get done? The trouble is that the mid-range ideas that Newcastle have been linked with, Mateta, Strand Larsen, those types of players from Premier League clubs, there's absolutely no way you can get the value for those players out of the deals, because what the selling club would have to accept is their situation. I mean, look at Wolves, look at Brentford. If they sell those players, then they're basically accepting that it's going to be a really, really difficult season without any time to replace them. And it's the same with Isak and Newcastle, really. If they sell Isak without a replacement, it basically explodes their season. This is the really difficult situation. This is why I'd said for so long that Newcastle should look abroad for a substitute striker, and then at least they've got some leverage in the striker department with Isak. Right now, the one thing that Isak has is that there is no other option. So him not playing ball has really cost Newcastle, and it's not helping him leave, but it's just making Newcastle's life difficult, which probably wouldn't be the case as much if they'd already signed a striker. So yeah, I think there's lessons to be learned this summer, but right now there is a really difficult situation. They've either got to pay over the odds for Wissa, because I think now it feels like 40 million isn't going to be enough, and I would probably look at walking away now. And that's no blame on Brentford's head, because they've well within their rights to do with Wissa what they want, as Newcastle are with Isak. Newcastle have moved into a position with Isak where they've put terms in place, but they would accept a bid probably of around 150 million if there were replacements in place, and that's probably the same in likelihood for Brentford. I think the price would become much less of an issue if Brentford had a striker to replace Wissa in, as well as Ouattara to replace Mbeumo. But they do have Sharda, and they do have Igor Thiago, who scored his first goal at the weekend as well. So we'll see whether it maybe does shift a little bit as the window goes on. But I just think at the moment it just feels so difficult to get that one done. Strand Larsen I'm no more confident with, and that's why I think Isak will still be at Newcastle by the end of the window. And I think maybe there might be an opening for another decent option on loan from a club, maybe a Ramos, maybe a Jackson. Jackson's a really interesting one, because Chelsea have 2 strikers. He wasn't featuring in that game. I don't think he's likely to come back into play over there. And I think they would quite like to get rid of him. So if you can come up with a deal, maybe a lower price, maybe a loan with an obligation, I wouldn't be against that with someone like Rasmus Højlund as well, but it looks like he's going to go to Italy and AC Milan. Lots of things still to go, but it doesn't look good for Newcastle on the striker situation with Strand Larsen talks, but again, I don't trust Wolves. The price for Wissa, Isak is just a completely separate entity, but isn't moving, and also the Samu injury is not good news. Even if Newcastle haven't made a play for him, he is now looking like an option off the table, because the seriousness of that injury, off the back of his reaction and being in tears, wasn't good. So let me know what you think about the striker situation. Where is left for Newcastle to go? People have mentioned Nick Walter-Marder in the comments yesterday, but Bayern Munich is still there, and the price feels a little bit of a risk. I don't think Newcastle, whether we'd like them to or not, because I think he's a wonderful player, I don't think Newcastle will be making that move. So is it really worth discussing in greater detail? But yeah, let me know in the comment section what you think. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Cheers.